The people that are saying we've gotten over these contradictions are actually trying to undermine struggles.
There's going to be a next step to the dialectic that you're not going to have foreseen.
I feel like this is really fucking hard. Hello. Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I'm Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori, and man, Austin, you have some dulcet tones on that hello there.
Was it? Did you hear my masculine baritone coming through?
Yeah, I almost thought you were Howlin' Wolf or something.
Hello. Welcome to Owls at Dawn, motherfuckers. So this week I'm stoked. We got George Ciccariello-Maher, who is an academic, activist, writer, and Twitter antagonizer par excellence. And we're going to talk about his most recent book, but more kind of like broader themes about dialectics. And he's an expert particularly on Venezuela. He's written a couple of books on particular issues pertaining to that regional context. But the conversation will not just be about Venezuela, even though it will touch on that. It'll talk about larger kind of political struggles more broadly, and whether or not this notion of the dialectic or of dialectics has practical purchase and theoretical purchase, and in what sense, and yada, yada, yada. So I'm stoked, so stick around for that in the main segment. But first, we need to give a shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is Mubi, as we announced last week. Remember that Mubi is an online streaming service that has a 30-day rotation for films. So every day they present a new film. They specialize in like timeless classics, indie darlings, foreign films for all you American speakers. If you are not American speaking, then they wouldn't be foreign films. They would be regional films for you. I've always wondered that when we're talking about films, we say foreign films, just presuming American hegemony. And maybe it's because we just had this conversation with George, but now I'm thinking like, see, we're using a particular narrative and we're kind of like allowing that to inform how it is that we even talk about movies, Troy. You ever thought about that?
Yeah, it's just like in the NBA where they have the rookies. The U.S. players play against the world players.
Right.
It's like, one, the U.S. is not part of the world, but then also the whole world is in some way united.
Right. Or baseball in
opposition.
Baseball is the World Championship.
The World Series.
Yeah. Football, it's the world.
That's just obvious, exceptionalism there.
Yeah.
There's multiple contradictions when it comes to the U.S. versus the world.
It is, totally, man.
But maybe that's more honest when you're thinking about U.S. exceptionalism.
Yeah, maybe. But so let's say that they present world cinema in the real sense of the term. So it's films that you might not otherwise have been able to track down, or films that you maybe haven't been introduced to before. And so you get this 30-day rotating library, and it's absolutely fantastic. So they're always 30 perfectly curated films, and you can check those out on Mubi. And Troy and I are going to talk to you a little bit about one of the films in particular that's playing. Now, they do have different libraries regionally. So, like, I'm in Australia right now, so my library is actually different than Troy's library in America. But I'll talk to you about mine in a minute. But Troy's going to talk about the American library and a particular highlight that we want to discuss.
Yeah, as Austin was saying, the 30-day rotation recently includes the movie Valhalla Rising by director Nicholas Winding Refn. You may know Refn from movies like Drive and is it God Only Knows that was with Ryan Gosling?
Yeah, God Only Knows. And Only God Forgives. Wait.
Only God Forgives, yeah.
Yeah, Only God Forgives.
Something like that.
And then Neon Demon, which I know a lot of people didn't love Neon Demon. I'm just a homer for Refn.
Yeah, he's fantastic. I mean, if you like his style, you pretty much like everything he does.
Basically, I'm like bought in as soon as he does anything. And it started with Drive. I remember I had almost a religious experience when I saw Drive. And so he also has, what is it, the Pusher trilogy? Yeah,
I've never seen those, but those are pretty popular overseas, I know for sure.
The first one is awesome. It's awesome. So Yeah, so I just love Refn as a filmmaker. And Valhalla Rising stars one of my favorite actors in the entire world, Mads Mikkelsen.
Absolutely, Mads Mikkelsen. So great. I saw this movie maybe 7 or 8 years ago, a long time ago, and it's a mindfuck, as all of his movies are. It's visually really compelling. It's basically like being on drugs while watching like medieval Scandinavians do crazy shit. And if you want to watch someone do crazy shit on drugs, it's definitely going to be Mads Mikkelsen, right?
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. So this is just a little sticky leaves for you. So go over to mubi.com/owls@dawn. And you can get a 30-day free extended trial. That's Mubi, mubi.com/owls@dawn to get a free extended trial so you can check that out. Like I said, there are different regional libraries around the world. And one of the things that I'm excited about in my library right now is Canton Dupieux has a new film out that I haven't seen. Now, for people who don't know who Canton Dupieux is, he is notorious for the film Rubber, which is about a serial killing tire. You heard that right?
T-I-R-E.
T-I,
yes.
or if you're in the UK, T-Y-R-E, you know. But yeah, like a rubber tire that goes around and kills people. He's an absurdist filmmaker. He's also a DJ. I think he goes by like Dr. Oizu or something like that. I can't remember his DJ name. But he also did a film called Wrong that is about a guy whose dog gets kidnapped and he tries to use the powers of like telekinesis to try to, or telepathy, I guess, to try to connect with his dog. It's a fucking weird, absurdist romp. And his new film is called Keep an Eye Out, which I have not seen yet, but I'm going to fucking see it right now because I love Canton Dupieux so much. So this is what I mean. There are kind of films that probably flew under the radar that you wouldn't be as familiar with. Go check it out at mubi.com/owls@dawn. Get your 30-day free extended trial and you can check that shit out.
Also, we should announce, Austin, that the Patreon poll, which we've had up for a couple weeks now, following up on our second Patreon suggested episode, has finished. It's ended.
Cool.
And the winner is the topic separating the art from problematic artists.
Ooh.
So one of the topics that was recommended to us was the idea of how do you think about work done by people, in the broadest sense, who are just not good people, but the work is somehow good. So whether it comes from art and artists, or from politicians and their politics, or philosophers and their philosophy, how do you reconcile or deal with problematic artists who otherwise do good work? That's a really rich topic and very broad. So we'll have a good think about how to address that in an episode, and we'll get back to y'all when we figure it out, yeah?
Yeah, I'm not going to lie, dude. Even you mentioning it gives me a little bit of anxiety thinking about it, because I feel like it is such an interesting, rich topic, but at the same time, I feel woefully inadequate to really think through it, just because I find it to be such a difficult topic, you know?
Well, you know why it's so difficult for you, Austin?
Why?
Because you're just not a problematic person, dude.
Have you
like,
talked
you need to do some more bad shit, and then it'll be a much more like immersive, subjectively led topic for you. Go commit some crimes, dude. Go do crimes.
Go do crimes. Oh, Jesus, man. So I'm stoked to talk about that. Also, a new bonus episode is out and live. It's me chatting with a horror film director who's a good buddy of mine named Andy Stewart. We talk about body horror and how horror kind of expresses some of the anxieties of culture and stuff like that, or his own particular anxieties. And we talk about kind of like why he's fascinated by horror films and what horror films do and which horror films he loves and things like that. And then, of course, there's the bonus episode that Troy and I did a couple of weeks ago on Bandersnatch. So if you want access to that as well, go over to patreon.com/owls@dawn and you can find out how to get access to those things.
All right, and before we get into the main parts of the episode, we have one review which we have to read. Again, we've said that if you leave us a review on iTunes or Spotify or wherever else, and you ask a simple, straightforward question in the review, we will name you, shame you, and then answer your question on air. So we have a review from Jay Powell from the United States of America, and he says, "Love it, guys. My favorite podcast to listen to." Thank you, Jay. Austin, you are my James Franco / Donald Glover. That's basically the best compliment you could ever get, isn't it?
My heart just swelled. If I was anxious before. Oh my God.
And then he says, "Troy, I wish you taught me everything." That's very broad.
Troy is my teacher as well.
What are your thoughts on the NBA so far this season? Who you got winning it all?
Oh shit.
No, I promise you, listeners.
Are you Jay Powell?
I am not Jay Powell. I would not go so low as to ask this question on air. I actually, despite what evidence says, I try to talk less about basketball than I want to.
That's
in the
true.
Podcast.
That is true. He's been censoring himself.
The people have called, right? They've made it clear they want more basketball content. So,
yeah.
Very quickly, Austin, any really general, basic thoughts about this season, and who do you have winning it all?
So one of the things I like about this season is it feels like the balance of powers is sort of evening out a little bit, right? I don't think it's a guarantee that the Warriors win. I think that they probably get there, although Houston is starting to heat up. James Harden's just scoring like a mofo. I don't.
Yeah, he scores 58 and they lose to the Nets.
I know. But if they can figure their ish out, then they could kind of heat up. Utah's getting hot again, which is good. Denver is all right. But then in the East, you got some fucking powers, man. Kawhi is the fucking king up there in our family to the north in Toronto. And Milwaukee's looking strong. The question is will they?
Man.
Right, dude. So the question is will they be? And then Boston, of course, is good, but who knows? They seem to be inconsistent. But the question is will they be able to stand up to some of can they stand up to the firepower of the West? Like I almost wonder if the Golden State Warriors are kind of on cruise control. Draymond can't hit a fucking shot to save his life. They've had some injury issues. There's all these questions about is Durant leaving next year. So maybe some of that stuff is kind of like, and they're probably kind of bored of the regular season a little bit, and obviously Steph was injured for a bit. So I want to see some fresh blood in the finals. I think it would be fun if the Warriors get to the conference finals, but then lose, and you see a new team from the West get to the finals against, I'm going to say, Kawhi's Raptors, and I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm going to say the Raptors are going to win.
Damn, that's definitely out on a limb, dude. But they're damn good. I mean, I would not dispute that at all. I do dispute a little bit saying the Warriors are looking weak. Yeah, I mean, they're definitely on cruise control, as every team that's in the 4th or 5th year of a dynasty has looked on cruise control.
Yeah.
Remember the Lakers in the 3rd year of the Kobe Shaq three-peat, won like 52 games or something and had like the 13th best net rating or something. They were just an almost mediocre team, and then they just trounced in the playoffs, everyone else. So I think the Warriors are definitely going to come out of the West, especially given that Houston's so much in shambles.
What do you think about like Denver, Utah? Do you think any of those teams can surprise?
No, they're going to get their asses swept by the Warriors.
Really?
Dude, the Warriors, Denver's in first place, and the Warriors played them a couple days ago, scored 51 points in the first quarter and just destroyed them.
Yeah, you almost feel like they can.
They didn't even really care. They were just like,
I know.
It's like they walked on the court and were just like, dudes, come on, we need to work out. Can you just get off the court? And the guys were like, we'll challenge you for it. And then they destroyed them.
Yeah. All right.
So the Warriors are definitely, barring injury, they're going to be there. But it's going to be fun to see either the Bucks or the Raptors or the Celtics in the finals there. Those teams are better than the last couple of Cavs teams. Obviously, LeBron makes that team, otherworldly in those years. But as a collective team, those teams are better.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about Philly? Too dysfunctional?
Nah, man. Jimmy Butler experience is just, he's a great player, man, but everywhere he goes, problems ensue.
Yeah. And Ben Simmons can't shoot.
It's going to be exacerbated in the playoffs, yeah. The fact that he won't shoot.
All right. Well, Jay Powell, thank you for the question.
All right, and so now we're getting into the shitty minutes. This is where one of us talks about whatever it is that's grinding our gears this week. So, Austin, what's got you down?
Well, so I have issued one mea culpa previously on this podcast, and it was when I talked shit about Wonder Woman before seeing Wonder Woman, and then I saw Wonder Woman, and I was like, wow, it was really good. I take back everything I said. It's a really fucking good movie, and I thought it was really interesting from a bunch of different levels. So I'm going to issue a second mea culpa. You know how you said in our end of the year episode that you struggle a lot of times and you were confessional with like our interview episodes? I feel like I struggle with every time I open my mouth. And it's this constant, and part of it is vanity, part of it is because you want to present yourself in a way that makes you look good. So I know that's a big part of it. But another part of it is that I really do feel a burden with being able to reach, thousands of people every week and talk about issues that I think are of the utmost importance. And after last week's episode with John, aka the Lit Crit guy, I actually was like in a funk all day because I felt one, that what I was trying to articulate was woefully inadequate to what one, I had written and I know how to talk about, but two, it just felt like I couldn't string a fucking coherent thought together. And I got a little bit flustered because I was almost so stimulated by the conversation. And this isn't in any way saying that the episode is weak. This is more just like my own like neurosis, let's say, about it upon reflection. But I was like so overstimulated by the topic that we were discussing that I had too many things to say, or too many things were coming into my mind, and I couldn't distill it into what I was really trying to articulate. And I said some things, and I think I misrepresented a couple of people, and particularly a podcast and some friends, Dead Pundit Society, with whom I have an amazing relationship with. Even if there are disagreements, they're brothers and sisters, you know? I mean, they're family. I have mad love. I mean, I should clarify, I have an amazing relationship with Amy from Dead Pundits. I don't really know Adam, engaged with him a couple of times online and shit like that, usually to try to kind of like push back on things in a productive, dialogical sense. But I'm very close with Amy, not just on Twitter and stuff like that, but we text often back and forth to kind of challenge each other and motivate each other and kind of just be there for each other as thinkers who are on the left that are kind of trying to not just simply assume the mantle of what's kind of popular a lot of times in left discourse. So yeah, primarily I mean Amy, but nevertheless I still view Adam as a sort of digital friend, if that makes sense. But I felt really guilty about kind of playing into this online discourse that is kind of identifying them as these like Strasserite class reductionist types. And I didn't call them a Strasserite, I know that. But nevertheless, by using the term that I did, which was the kind of a class reduction, even though I don't like that term, I actually reject it because I think it assumes a certain framework of the relation between capital and labor that I kind of fundamentally reject as being an outdated kind of simple binary or dialectical relationship, which we will talk about with George in the next segment. Nevertheless, and so I referred to it more as a class restriction. I still feel like I wasn't very clear, and I mentioned them very briefly, but then we kind of continued to like criticize certain types of reductive materialisms without me clarifying that I wasn't referring to them anymore. So it made it seem like I was just pouring on, at least that's how it came across to me, that I was just like pouring on that somehow, you know, these people that I love and that I respect their work and that are really fucking trying hard to organize on the left. I felt like I threw them under the bus a little bit. And I did. I felt like shit. And I actually, like, for the week after, I was, like, almost going to, even before the episode was released, I was going to, like, email Adam Proctor, who's one of the co-hosts, and I was going to be like, hey, dude, do you want to come on to talk about your position? Because he's critical of certain kind of, like, movements. And even if I ultimately fundamentally disagree, and I think I do on a lot of levels, I think having a productive dialogue would be something that would be worthwhile. But I felt really shit. I felt gross afterwards, man, and I was kind of in a funk, you know? So it's a mea culpa, it's an I'm sorry, and it's an apology, even though I'm not necessarily saying that I'm not still critical. But it's just the way that I did it, it didn't feel right. And I think it's because I just always feel, I don't know, I feel a burden about like what I'm saying, what comes out of my mouth. I feel like there's a responsibility, and I want to take responsibility for what comes out of my mouth. And then at the same time, I also want to get better with learning from the inadequacies of the things that do come out of my mouth. And so I don't know, mea culpa, I just felt like shit, you know? I just got to get better at becoming an effective communicator, you know? Being a scatterbrain is great, but sometimes when you're talking about political shit, there are consequences, and you know, I just want to be more careful. So that's my shitty minute. Yeah,
man. I mean, that's some great Owls After Dark confessional content right there.
Yeah.
I appreciate that, though, because sometimes especially like when you're working in academic philosophy or something, it's very, very easy to criticize someone's views and just expect that it doesn't in any way affect the person,
right,
or their work, right? Right. It's just given that you're going to critique everything you come across. That's just the standard response to any ideas to critique it. And then you take that to other areas like, say, politics, where it's not as easy as separation between the person and their work. And also, you know, disparaging someone's work can also hurt the effectiveness of that work, right, or give a false view of the effectiveness of their work. And it can be pretty easy for philosophy types to forget that. I think it's a good corrective that you've mentioned here about, it's not just about being friendly or being nice or being a good person. It's about actually like doing what's right, you know, giving, credence to somebody who does good work, and, you know, sort of approving that and recognizing that they have done good work. And that's really important.
Yeah.
It's not a given, right?
No, It's not a given. It's not a given. And it's weird. Even if my criticism were to come from a different direction, it's real easy because I might use a word that is similar to another criticism's word that they use, and then it might seem like I'm heaping on to that particular criticism in a particular framework, when it's a much more nuanced discussion. The problem is philosophers are, at least they think they're immune from the consequences that issue, but we realize that there are perlocutionary effects, and the words, once they're out there in the fucking public sphere, they no longer belong to you, and they can attach to other power relations, let's say. They can attach to other linguistic structures, and I just want to be more careful with what I say, how I say it, and what context in which I say it, because it's really easy for me as a philosopher to just like fucking throw my shit in there and do like a conceptual critique or create new concepts or whatever. And I think that I don't want to ever lose that, but at the same time, sometimes it's okay to like shut your fucking mouth, and sometimes it's okay to wait until you're in private to talk with somebody, or sometimes it's okay to say things that don't necessarily just simply articulate the thing that you want to say. Because guess what, man? The world isn't just about you. so I, there's something to learn and improve upon. So that was it. My shitty minute is about me being a dumbass. All right. So I am more than delighted to welcome this week's guest. It's George. And George, you're going to have to help. Is it Ciccariello-Maher?
That is perfect. Amazing.
Is that, and I know there's like is it, because it's hyphenated, so there's probably a cool way to say it with a non-gringo accent.
No, that was perfect. That's
Oh, is it? Okay. I've been hanging out.
It's a very rare, situation for me to have.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I've been hanging out with a lot of Brazilians here in Sydney, and they have a lot of like Italian last names, like Bellotti and La Presa, and it's just been so interesting to kind of see I guess the way that I didn't realize how strong the Italian influence was in Latin America. I know so much about like the Portuguese influence in Brazil, and there's like German colonies randomly around from 20th century and stuff like that. But I didn't realize from the era of colonization how the Italian influence had seeped its way down there. Is Ciccariello-Maher, is that Italian? Because the pronunciation with the single ch c and then the double k c.
It is Italian, but it is not. I'm not from Latin America. I should say.
Okay.
This is it's sort of an Italian American name, and the Mar is an Irish American name. So I feel like I should say that ahead of time. But yeah, the Italian influence in Latin America is interesting and uneven, and it's tied up also with like the influence of anarchism and all sorts of interesting things in Mexico and Argentina in particular.
Okay. Yeah. It is something that's super interesting. So for people who don't know George's work, he is a writer. He's an activist in Philly. He is currently visiting scholar at the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics. The books that he's written are We Created Chavez, Building the Commune, and Decolonizing Dialectics is the most recent. Are there any other books that I'm missing that you'd written?
Nope, that's it for the books. Hopefully some more soon, but...
Right. And so... for people who also don't know George's work, he's extremely active online with, let's say, advocating for indigenous struggles. He does a lot of work on the pink tide, or what he kind of refers to as the sort of red tide variants in Latin America, particularly paying attention to Venezuela. But he's also somebody whose work I've been extremely drawn to because he has a very astute philosophical background. And one of the things I'm starting to realize more in my sort of own research journeys are the shortcomings of certain disciplines. So, you have people in political sciences who they use philosophical terms and they appeal to philosophical resources, but are oftentimes very kind of vacuous in their philosophical analysis. Or in the philosophical circle, by contrast, which is the one I'm most familiar with, people talk about politics, but it's all very sort of abstract, theoretical, and a lot of times it doesn't have the grounding. And so what you end up having is a sort of like tension with people on the politics side who are like, you're just abstract and theoretical, and then philosophers who are like, well, you don't really understand what the term ontology means. But George's work, it seems to me to have this really lovely balance that he's perpetually working through and refining and deepening. And I think this is most stridently seen in his latest work, which is a work of political philosophy called Decolonizing Dialectics. And so I reached out to him and I said, would you like to come on to talk about not just the book itself? Obviously, we will be, because it kind of frames the discussion. But more importantly, what do you mean by decolonizing dialectics? And I figured that would be kind of a lovely conversation to have. Does that sound good for everybody?
Yeah, it sounds great. And to hear, to sort of hear it described so harmoniously is wonderful, because I think the actual experience of being, for example, trained as a political theorist in a political science department at the fringes of other disciplines and approaches, ethnic studies, rhetoric, of course, philosophy, is more often experienced as a painful, kind of painful in-betweenness. And I like to think that that's productive, and that it then, to hear that it comes off as something, more productive in that sense is certainly heartening to me.
I mean, when I read it, and I think it's because I just finished my first book, and we'll talk a little bit about it throughout, because I actually think that you do something serendipitously that is basically like the sequel to the book that my book is about, which is Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason. And I think that your book is in many ways a kind of sequel to that book, interestingly enough. And I could feel the agonism of your research when reading through and when listening to talks and things like that, when you discuss decolonizing dialectics. I can feel you trying to really navigate this difficult terrain between these various resources. You primarily situate, I think, your text, it's fair to say, between Georges Sorel, Frantz Fanon, and the liberation philosopher Enrique Dussel.
Yes.
And weaving them together, these supposedly disparate figures, I can feel the difficulty, but I think there was something really lovely about not shortchanging the theoretical to try to rush to the practical. You engage with him a little bit, but John Beasley Murray's book, Post-Hegemony, is a book that I found to be really influential, because I have also a Deleuzian background. So his criticism of hegemony was something that I found very informative, a few years ago when I had read it. And then I just revisited it actually recently last year. But and I know you engage with him a little bit in the footnotes, if not at least substantively throughout. And one of the things that I think that you criticize that book for, even though I think the work is worthwhile, and I think the case studies are very interesting, is perhaps that he does rush a little quickly in trying to wed together political case studies, let's say, with his theoretical. And I really like his theoretical ideas, this idea of excess and something that always escapes. And I think that fits with your kind of work too, on like exteriority and the liminal and stuff like that. But maybe he rushes a little quickly, whereas you seem to really try to not rush through that in order to make your practical points. Would you say that that's pretty accurate?
Again, I'm really glad to hear that that's how it comes off. So, maybe of sort of biographical interest is the fact that Decolonizing Dialectics was actually my dissertation. It was, in other words, the project that I began first, and that I was writing while I was living in Venezuela. And so I'm reading these thinkers, and I'm reading their sort of theories of combat and sort of a radicalized dialectics that seek to set an otherwise frozen history into motion anew. And I'm seeing it happen around me. This is around 2006, at the very sort of like apex of Chavismo in power. And so this was it was very difficult, I think, for me to focus on the theory and to restrain that jump to the political. At least I didn't have to, because I was doing both at once. I ended up writing a book, We Created Chavez, about the history of revolutionary movements, in which, if you read it, you can actually see the theoretical elements of decolonizing dialectics in kind of latent form, and then simultaneously writing that book, laying out the theory, thinking hard through what it means to engage in these kind of struggles, and what it means to think through a dialectics in the Venezuelan context, in a context that is, apparently post-colonial, but of course substantively still very colonial, but many other things at once.
So without assuming that people listening have like a robust understanding of what dialectics means, and I think this is actually one of the things that I find myself getting frustrated and bogged down with in the literature as well, is people throw this term around. It's dialectical, or it's insufficiently dialectical, or it's the dialectic, which is something you make efforts to distance yourself from using, like the definite article, right? Like how do you define dialectics? What is dialectics, and what is it that you're seeking to do to distance yourself from that kind of like primary or let's say originary interpretation of the term?
Sure. So I think one thing that we need to think about and understand is that with all of our concepts, we're making decisions about how to use them. And I'm not, in this sense, I'm not very much a philosopher. That I'm not looking for some kind of pure definition. I'm not looking for the true definition of what dialectics is or should be. But I'm thinking about what kind of a lens will cast light on the realities that I'm trying to understand, that I think others are trying to understand. And so when I think about dialectics, I think about the dynamic movement of oppositions, the dynamic movement of clashes. And I think about it against, for example, the idea that history changes gradually through small changes. I think about it against the idea that history changes inevitably. And here we get a little toward, the transformation of that dialectics. And so we're talking about what kind of clashes and ruptures and moments of explosive, appearance and rebellion set our histories into motion, push history into motion, especially when there is no reason to think that it would actually move forward. One of the important sort of beginning points for thinking of decolonized dialectics is to shed this idea that history does move forward, that it's got an internal movement outside of those struggles themselves. Because, if there's one thing that I think many colonized and racialized people and enslaved people certainly would reject, it's the idea that history has a sort of forward motion, and much less that motion is toward progress, something better, an improved, more rational world, to kind of, use some of the Hegelian language. If you're snatched up out of your homeland and shipped across the Middle Passage and enslaved, you see very little forward motion in that world. And the only forward motion that you then seize onto, as in the case of Haiti or in the case of the resistance by slaves in the U.S. South, is that struggle that you undertake, a struggle that you don't expect to win, that you have no reason to think will be successful, and yet appears as the only option on the horizon.
Totally random. I mean, not totally random, but when you were talking about like the idea of being displaced, have you seen Roma?
Yes.
Alfonso Cuarón's. What did you think of? So I had just finished doing a book club on Henri Lefebvre's The Production of Space. And then I actually presented at a conference with a couple of colleagues where we were talking about this idea of spatiality. And I felt like the background of this that was so profound was this idea of displacement of indigenous peoples. And I couldn't help but think from like a sort of critical geography perspective, as sort of like framing the backdrop. And then, of course, it's called Roma and I feel like there's a double entendre there of Rome, but also that area in Mexico City.
Yes.
And so I couldn't help but think of the context and think about displacement of native peoples. And then there's that scene where they're in this bar and one person had his land taken away. And so this idea of land expropriation is also in the background. What did you think of Roma?
I think it's a great film, and I think some of those things that you mentioned are certainly front and center. I was lucky enough to have lived in La Roma in Mexico City, which is also gave it a certain beauty and recognizable, familiar beauty to me, because it looks exactly like that, right? Very much of it has been preserved, the Art Deco facades, etc. And I think what's important about the film, but growing out of, I think, the mainstream narrative, which is to say, the fact that this is a story told more or less from the perspective of an indigenous woman, that indigenous languages are used. I think that's a representation of what I would call the question of exteriority in a decolonized dialectics. In other words, it's not simply about the sort of internal exploitation within an existing system of the working class. It's about the invisibility and the exclusion of colonized, racialized people. Now, of course, when you watch the film, you see that this exclusion is kind of paradoxical, because you're talking about someone who is at the very heart of the white domestic sphere, right? Who is at the function, it's central to the functioning of it. And this liminality of people of color and colonized people is crucial. And I've argued, for example, in the case of Venezuela, that if you're talking about the city of Caracas, there's this interesting contrast where, poor people who live in the poorest barrios, in other words, these very dangerous places, predominantly of the poorest and darker skinned Caraqueños, they know the entirety of the city because they go and circulate through it to the wealthier areas to work, to sell goods. So they move across the city. They know it's functioning. They know how its circulation works. And yet when you talk about the wealthy, those who have the most to say about Venezuelan society. Those are who have the most opinions, even about what it's like to live in a poor or dangerous barrio, who tell you not to go there. You'd think that they knew and had this intimate knowledge of what it's like to live in poor neighborhoods, but they literally have never set foot there. And so what you have is this really interesting situation, epistemological situation, in which knowledge, the knowledge of the poor and excluded, is crucial, is central. They're the ones who really grasp the full functioning of that society.
I had a quick question for you, George. Getting back to the decolonizing dialectics here for a moment. I know you've been critical of Zizek and Badiou and other continental philosophers who have also dealt with sort of post-Hegelian type philosophy and have influence from Marxism and other forms of social theory. Do you think it's correct to say, given the title of the book is Decolonizing Dialectics, there's a sense in which you have to set up the idea of what a colonized dialectics is first, to then sort of undo it, or to do what you call radical dialectics, and that there's some sense in which this set of other continental philosophers who maybe are asking some of the same questions should be criticized for their Eurocentrism or something along those lines, and that exists because they don't recognize sort of the existence of the colonized dialectics.
Certainly, and I think these questions manifest differently in different thinkers. I mean, they're explicitly colonial dialecticians, right? In certain ways, you could say this of Hegel, who, as sort of Buckmorse and others have recognized, writes about dialectics while the Haitian Revolution is happening, possibly drawing upon that, certainly recognizing the importance of struggle for subjective and objective reasons, but also sort of sublimating all of that into a very colonial vision. And you see elements of that, especially in the early Marx. If you're talking about this question of progressive history, if you're talking about the singularity of the parameter, in other words, the class struggle driving forward the global dialectic of history. And I think there are different ways to pull these apart and different elements that fall away once you do. One is just to say, well, what does it look like from the perspective of the colonized, right? Subjectively, but also in terms of their concrete conditions. So the Peruvian communist, José Carlos Mariátegui, writes about what he calls Peruvian reality. And he says, well, I'm a Marxist, I'm a communist, but I'm going to sit down and look around me. And what he realizes when he does, is that the class constellation, I mean, just doing a Marxist analysis, the class constellation is completely different. And, you don't have a developed bourgeoisie with any interests in developing, deepening the means of production, and strengthening, productivity, for example, the forces of production, expanding productive capacity. And as a direct result, even from a Marxist perspective, you therefore don't have a strong proletariat. In other words, you have a very variegated and sort of, multiply, sort of segmented class apparatus. And Mariátegui, the point is not to say that you can then move forward, as certain sort of communist thinkers would have argued, through capitalism. This is something that Marx himself abandoned later in life, the idea that you have to move forward through capitalism, but that you can build, and need, in fact, to build on that basis, to build a certain sort of an alternative vision. So this is what it means to decolonize dialectics. It means to begin to even look at class structures and how they're different. It also means to think about coloniality, and this is using the term of Aníbal Quijano, another Peruvian, very much influenced by Mariátegui, who just died a few years ago. But by coloniality, he means the long-term structures of colonialism that are economic, that are political, but also epistemological, that are racial, that are gendered, and to begin to root these out of not only our thinking about the world, but also our organizing and how it is that we understand the change that we seek to sort of embody.
So yeah, we've recently been doing a little book club every so often, going through G.A. Cohen's lecture series turned into a book, If You're an Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich? And one of the criticisms that he levels, and we've mentioned this multiple times on the podcast, so forgive us for being a fucking broken record here, but he's mentioned this a few times, where he has this model that he's trying to argue against in what he sees within certain Marxist circles that he calls the Obstetric Model. And it's the idea that, history is pregnant with socialism, and that it's just the job of the socialist theorist to just simply articulate the contradictions of capitalism, to motivate the proletariat to overcome those contradictions and to assume the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? And he says that there's something problematic about this. And one of the things that he finds problematic is that how do you unify a factory worker in Oregon in the late 1990s, early 2000s when he's writing this, with somebody who's very needy in a oh God, what's in Brazil in a favela or something like that, right? Like they have very different experiences of the exploitation or oppression or whatever that they are encountering. How do you unite someone who's making $50,000 a year, $40,000 a year, but is still experiencing properly exploitative extraction of surplus value with somebody who is just simply barely surviving and maybe doesn't even have a job, but is involved in the black market and is working for cash under the table, but is really somebody who exists on the margins or at the exterior? And Cohen says that Marxism doesn't ultimately, in its more orthodox obstetric model, doesn't have an answer to how to unify those things. So then you get people like Brian Leiter, who comes along, who's an American analytic philosopher, and he says that, he literally, I shit you not, I am not misrepresenting him. He said that the United States is 100 years away from any possibility because there's just not enough oppression yet that's felt yet. Like, and to me, there's like this weird kind of gross accelerationism in that, where he's basically saying, well, we just need to experience more horrors before the proletariat will properly feel like that they're oppressed, or that they will properly feel that rage that Fanon talks about, which just seems so gross to me. And it seems like what you're saying is, no, we don't need to wait to feel more exploitation. Let's fucking curb that, and let's cut that off at the head before it even happens. Is that kind of right?
Yeah, that's certainly a part of it. And there are so many problems with what you're calling the obstetric model, although it's important, although it reflects something very, very real about what it means to, it was in many ways a discussion of political violence, right? Violence and revolution is this midwife that helps to bring into being something which is growing. And I'm very much, follow in the footsteps of C.L.R. James, who continued to insist on the new world growing within the shell of the old. And I think that's a crucial way to think about how we engage in our struggles. But the problem was how automatic this assumption was, right? The idea that, first of all, there was a direct relationship between class condition and class consciousness. That if you lived and worked like a worker, if you were in the factory sitting next to each other and engaging with other workers, that the result would be class consciousness that would become and could become a revolutionary consciousness. You don't need to go beyond social class as an economic phenomenon to understand that this was not accurate, and certainly not transhistorically accurate. This is what Sorel in France confronted, because he began to look at the functioning of hegemony. In other words, the ideological attack on the idea of revolution, the ways in which socialists themselves, democratic socialists, were undermining that revolutionary idea, and as a result realized that they needed to intervene even more, to fight against this, to engage and unleash struggles. But especially once you get beyond this sort of simplistic uniparameter of the formal working class versus the bourgeoisie, you begin to realize that, as you mentioned, the majority of Latin American poor are involved in the informal economy. That means a bunch of different things. It could mean just selling goods, what would be called simple circulation. One interesting thing about that in Venezuela, is where I know it best, is that you don't have a boss, right? Like, this narrative about fighting the boss. Right. The boss is the market. Right. And the boss is often state and local officials that are trying to restrict your ability to access public space to engage in that, in that activity. And so the political and ideological parameters are not automatically derived from the economic condition. And so we need to be much more creative and think about not only the fact that this is not automatic, that hegemony is something that we need to engage. In other words, to build alternative ideas and narratives and explanations about why people are suffering, but also that this differs asymmetrically, on the global level. People have long and rightly emphasized the fact that while hegemony is everywhere, in other words, while ideology matters everywhere, in the formerly colonized world, force matters more. Right? And so this question of ideology is much more important in the global north, but it's also bound up with economic questions, right? Ideology can matter because we're also being, propped up by elaborate systems of debt and extraction from the global south that make it possible for us to convince ourselves that things are going okay. So I think it really just means that we need to be, there are certain overarching parameters, right? A skepticism toward the idea of progress, a skepticism toward the idea that there's an automatic movement of history, and that these struggles will simply emerge from the conditions of people, but also the need for a much more nuanced, global, anti-colonial analysis of what it looks like to struggle in different contexts.
George, earlier you mentioned something about the way that teleology plays a role in the colonized dialectics. Do you see a pretty strict separation between the colonized dialectics on one hand being necessarily teleological and the decolonized dialectics that you're referring to, radicalized dialectics, being necessarily anti-teleological?
So yeah, by teleology we mean the idea that history moves toward a kind of single objective, and often if we're speaking about dialectics, we're talking about that objective being the resolution of contradictions, right? For Hegel, the idea of absolute mind and a fully rational society. And for Marx, we're talking about communism, which is quite explicitly the resolution of all kind of earthly contradictions in social form. And I think you can certainly have, and this holds, I think, for a lot of parameters that I talk about in decolonizing dialectics, you can have a non-teleological dialectics that remains Eurocentric and arguably colonial. I mean, this is the case of a lot of the so-called negative dialectics that emerges in the European context, thinking about elements of the Frankfurt School and others. But what remains in some ways colonial has a lot to do with location, the kind of parameters, the sort of empirical data that they're drawing into their analysis. But I'm not so sure that the reverse can be true. I think it's difficult to have, for reasons that I've kind of already mentioned, it's difficult to have a decolonized dialectics that maintains a teleological understanding of moving forward toward an absolute sort of end. I think there are different reasons for this. And insofar as we maybe strip down that telos to something very, very basic, in other words, we're constantly moving forever toward this resolution, this universal humanity. I mean, that's something that someone like Frantz Fanon will certainly be on board with. He just thinks that we're very far from there. We don't know what it's going to look like. He, as I put it in the book, defers and displaces the universal resolution of contradictions because what he sees around him, he's dealing with questions of race and decolonization. He sees people saying, the people that are saying we've gotten over these contradictions are actually trying to undermine struggles. Think about race today, for example. Who's telling us to forget about the importance of race and white supremacy? It's our enemies. And so while we may hold out a universal horizon, that universal horizon, I think, remains very undefined because we are engaged in struggles that are transforming that horizon. Because in a decolonized dialectics, the parameters are many, right? You're talking about race, class, gender, ethnicity, language, global south, global north. And once these parameters begin to interact with and rebound off of each other, once they collide with each other, it's very difficult to know, what the future looks like.
Yes, it seems there's really like an epistemological arrogance at the heart of a lot of it, in the sense that given the way that this fabric of contradictions weaves in and out and has this feedback loop on itself and changes over time, anytime that you want to, in some sense, argue that you have the whole system figured out, it's not going to happen. There's going to be a next step to the dialectic that you're not going to have foreseen. And there's some sense in which you theoretically have to be open to that space that you haven't covered yet, while still being able to be creative and move on with what you have.
Right. And I mean, epistemological arrogance is the hallmark of European philosophy. Like, it was built around that. The whole point of the ego cogito and the founding of Western philosophy by Descartes is based on this, not only a separation of mind and body, but also the idea that you occupy a position that allows you to see everything and see the universal, and that makes your particular location not particular at all, but universal, right? And so most of the theories that we've inherited, and here in just a very, very base level of resisting Eurocentrism, most of the theories that we've inherited are based on empirical data drawn from Europe and the United States, right? And so what kind of hubris, to put it even more strongly, what kind of hubris is involved in thinking that you understand the world and the future of the world based on those parameters? Like, you can have a theory of the way in which class is going to develop, for example, the heavy industrialization in the global south today, right? The persistence of the formal working class in many of these locations. But still, even at that point, you're speculating on how this is going to play out, how we'll interact with questions of nation and race in the future. And so much of that is so difficult to predict, that that the arrogance is something that really needs to be broken down, and we need to begin much more from a position of epistemological humility.
And I think what I like about the way that you place this kind of epistemological humility is oftentimes, or at least in some contexts, labeling someone as hubristic or arrogant or whatever can be a shutdown to conversation, can be a shutdown to thinking. But it's the exact opposite here, right? It's the sort of encouraging or stimulating to thought through humility, right? Well, I don't know enough. We don't know enough yet. So we must think in all these different forms and ways. And that seems so much more productive than the way it can sometimes be cast.
Yeah, and this is this great Colombian philosopher, contemporary philosopher, Santiago Castro Gomez, has a great book called, it's not translated yet, called 0 Point Hubris. And this is the 0 point question, right? The idea of Western philosophy is being located at the 0 point with a God's eye view. And simply refusing that as hubris is instead very productive, as you put it, right? Because it means looking more closely at history. And it means looking more closely at reality. It means, for Mariátegui, looking at Peruvian reality. And this is why and I've argued this, in different places, that the idea and the category of reality is very important for sort of Black and anti-colonial thinking. People rely on their reality and their lived experience of that reality as the sort of epistemological leverage point for beginning to think differently.
Yeah, this has been one of my more recent kind of concerns, I guess, let's say, with Marxist framing of the critique of political economy, is that the category of the contradictions between capital and labor itself seems to be a very particular constitutive relationship that does not allow, he even admits it does not allow for the lumpen proletariat when he's writing in the 19th century. And so then you get Maoism, which is explicitly concerned with the people who are non-industrialized workforce, right? Yep. And so it seems like the importance of a decolonized dialectics, from what I can gather, is that you are intentionally disavowing a more restrictive definition of the contradictions themselves as a priori categories. And this is Sartre's criticism of Marxism in his day. So he's writing at the end of the 50s, after the invasion of Hungary by the USSR, and he's saying, well, okay, so what is it? Like yes, it's wrong from an empirical perspective, but what is it formally speaking, methodologically speaking, that allowed the USSR, that determined the USSR's actions so that they felt justified? And for him, it goes down to the notion of totality. And so he criticizes particularly Lukács as being like the theorist of totality par excellence, as somebody who puts, in his existentialist framework, who puts essence before existence, who puts logos before reality. And so Sartre wants to invert that and say, no, the dialectic is simply that which exists in the material relation between humans and the conditions of exigence in which they find themselves. And if we open ourselves up to that understanding of the dialectic, that means that it's not the dialectic, but it's dialectics, plural. And that dialectical logics are going to differ depending on the different context. And that typical 19th century Marxist formulations, they're a bit too restrictive. They're a bit too limited because they can only see things in terms of this industrial relation between capital and labor. And they don't have any understanding of indigenous persons or any other type of individual that would exist outside of the value process as so defined in those very strict parameters.
Yes, no, absolutely. And here I think there's a sort of interesting case study of theoretical, I won't say decolonization, but attentiveness to decolonial dynamics that should be borne in mind. So if we start from the end, we see Critique of Dialectical Reason published. Frantz Fanon loves it. And these are, thinkers who are politically aligned at this moment. The Algerian war is raging. Fanon is getting very sick and on the verge of dying, and on the verge of also publishing Wretched of the Earth. He loves the critique of dialectical reason. Part of the reason he loves it is because, I argue that there's been very little attention to the fact that Sartre's philosophy is transformed by anti-colonial struggle and by Fanon's criticisms in particular. Because if we take a step back, we see Sartre in 1948 prefacing, this Black negritude poetry anthology with an argument that says that race is particular, class is universal. And we know that while Black poetry is great, we support it, while negritude, Black identity is a great necessary movement, we know that it will then give way to universal class. And Fanon, writing in 1952 then, was sharply critical of this. He felt, as he put it, robbed by Sartre, who had deprived him of not only the weight of his own, Black identity and its importance politically, but also because he sort of claimed to know the future of the world, right? And again, if we're talking about multiple parameters and the ways in which race and class and colonialism and gender and all these interact, it's simply nonsense to make that argument. And it's through this criticism, I think, that Sartre then adopts a more, on the one hand, a more principled stand alongside colonial struggles, but also philosophically, an understanding in which the weight of historical reality impinges more directly on colonial and racialized subjects in determining, for example, their relative level of existential freedom.
Could we say that, so when Sartre says that race is particular and class is singular, and Fanon criticizes, could we say that what Sartre was neglecting in 48 was that class, as so defined, is already a racialized category, but it's a racialized category in terms of European raciality?
Absolutely,
like
certainly.
Right.
And this, there are a couple of things. That's one. And that's where, when you look at Fanon and the Wretched of the Earth, he says, enough of this Europe where dialectics has become a logic of the same, or a logic of stasis, where essentially the white working class, to put it in a certain way, has sold out and supported the colonial endeavor and supported the war in Algeria. And even leftist critics, are, very, very limited. And very few certainly were willing to stand, as Sartre would eventually do, in support of the Algerian revolutionaries. Most people did what we're very familiar with, right? They stood and they said, well, I guess Algeria should be free, but I don't support them using violence to do that, right? I don't support them doing this or that. When the fundamental question is there an unjustified political system of domination? And if so, then you abolish it, you destroy it, and you destroy it by any means. And then on top of that, you have the fact that what I think Sartre didn't realize, writing in 1948, was that the anti-colonial wave of struggle was coming. There were certain premonitions of it, but there's this interesting phrasing where Sartre in Black Orpheus, in other words, in 1948, says to a European, he says, "What did you think when you unbound those mouths? That they would sing your praises?" It's something like that. I've probably gotten it wrong. But then when he's writing later in his preface to Wretched of the Earth, in other words, in 1961, he says those mouths opened on their own. They opened by themselves. In other words, the point was the active presence of revolutionary struggle across the Third World changed his own philosophical outlook for the better.
Yeah, so Robert Bernasconi is a Sartre scholar,
Yes.
and he says that the reason that Sartre abandoned...
He and I have disagreed on this point, but yes.
Okay, so you might know where I'm going to go with this. So for people listening, so Critique of Dialectical Reason is, the way we have it now in 2019, is in 2 volumes. Sartre published the first volume in 1960. He did not end up publishing the second one. It was published posthumously, and it's an incomplete work. Robert Bernasconi's argument is that the reason that Sartre doesn't finish is because he started to realize that maybe Fanon's Wretched of the Earth is going in the direction that his own work was incapable of articulating.
Oh no, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, no, that seems accurate to me. And we eventually see these tensions play out, after Fanon's death, where Sartre ends up maintaining a Zionism that Fanon would not have, endorsed after 1967. And so you have the withdrawal by the request of Fanon's family of Sartre's preface from the Wretched of the Earth over these questions. And I think they're very much related to what degree can this sort of, king philosopher of the French scene embrace, recognize, understand what it means to work alongside revolutionary movements on the global south? And what are the limits to that? What kind of limitations are there in thought and in practice?
Troy, did you want to jump in? I've been blabbing.
Oh, you're the start guy, man. This is all inside baseball to me.
Okay, well, here then what I'll do is I'll just really quickly. I do want to say this just because I wanted to let you know, George. I said it at the beginning. One of the things that I found so lovely about your work, and I'm actually rereading it right now, is that so Sartre says Marxism stopped. It was too driven by totality. And the reason that the USSR was able to justify its own invasion of Hungary is because it drew the lines of acceptability. And it stood outside of it, immune to any sort of criticism because it wasn't even involved. It's kind of like the state of exception sort of thing, even though he doesn't argue that. But that the state itself, they were able to draw the lines to determine what is right, what is wrong, and therefore anything that takes place within that matrix is justified because fuck it, they're the ones who are sovereign, I guess you could say. And he does use that. The idea of the institution is how he develops it in Volume 1, and then in Volume 2 he tries to do an analysis of Stalin and he ends up stopping. But one of the things that I think is interesting with your work is where Sartre says he wants to kind of reformulate dialectical reason. He wants to reformulate what dialectical thought means. Is you do something similar through the framework of like the decolonized orientation. But it's not just dialectical thought. And I think you take this from, is it C.L.R. James, where you say it's dialectical practice, right? What's the difference between dialectical thought and dialectical practice as you define it?
I mean, this is such a fraught question, and there's so many different ways to look at it. But one way to look at it is to say, you could have the best analysis of what dialectics looks like, of what dialectical struggles, decolonial dialectics, even in the present, and yet you could be positioning yourself in relation to that with a kind of bird's eye view. And as a result, there's something that's lost, first of all. Second of all, dialectics as analytics in that sense is incapable, I think, of grasping something which I think is crystallized in that Fanon critique of Sartre that I mentioned, where he's talking about the weight of his own identity as a driving force in the world. He's saying, if you're telling me that in 50 or in 100 years, race will give way to class as the universal category, then why the fuck would I believe in race? And not that Fanon believes in it as a biological category, but Black identity as a category of struggle. And you can't have a category of struggle function if you are thinking about its eventual passing, in other words, to use a dialectical term. And this is something that, I think also, people like, different thinkers, I think, address these questions very well. Jameson, for example, in Valences of the Dialectic, gets at the idea of what happens when a category passes too quickly. And this is part of what I mean in the book when I talk about inhabiting the center of the dialectic. This is part of what Fanon does when he's critiquing Sartre. He says, listen, we're not talking about the horizon. We're not talking about the future. We're not talking about the telos and the resolution, because what happens when you speak that way is that you give up too much of what's happening in the present. That telos, that universal, taints and contaminates your understanding of the present and your ability to reflect upon it. So, another great example that James, another C.L.R. James in The Black Jacobins talks about in the context of the Haitian Revolution is that Toussaint Louverture, who helped to lead the Haitian Revolution, eventually fails because he's so enamored of the universal and of the French universal and of liberty, equality, and fraternity as these almost abstract principles, that what he misses is what's right, as James puts it, right in front of his nose, which is the fact that this was a Black struggle against white oppressors. And this is not a biological struggle, it's a political struggle, because the white oppressors were slaveholders, were attempting to reinstitute slavery. And so this is what was missed by focusing on the universal horizon. And this is what is missed if we think about dialectics as a kind of bird's eye view analytic of the world.
Yeah, to kind of, I feel like this entire conversation is really framed around this tension between the universal and the singular,
Yes.
right? Or the universal and the particular. And this is something that you see in contemporary American politics with people fighting it out over, identity politics versus like class and economic categories. And this is something you see just kind of all over the place. And I feel like this is really fucking hard, just in general, right? To figure this out. Like, it is really difficult. I mean, what do you think are some pointers for helping us think through this tension? I mean, I guess read the book is one way, because I think I think that's one of the things you are doing. But
you don't got so. I think I think first I would say we're not looking for answers. We're looking for parameters, right?
Okay.
And what those parameters I think imply are that I, for example, don't want to give up on the idea of the universal. Or the idea of universalism, because very much following Fanon, we're talking about the resolution of contradictions in tendentially more, sort of deeper ways. We're talking about people coming together and existing alongside each other as actual humans, right? And that's not something that I'm trying to foreclose upon. In other words, I'm not trying to argue for a pure particularity. As Fanon's great teacher, Aimé Césaire, puts it, he says, I want a universal that is rich with all that is particular, in which we stave off the weight, the sort of imposing weight of universalism, as an attempt to think through what it would mean to build a universal as a project. And often that involves actually realizing how many false universals exist, and we can look at this, I think, in a lot of different ways. But the primary way that, again, Western thought functions with relation to the universal is that, as I mentioned with Descartes, for example, but it's really the essence of Western philosophy is to elevate a particular and call it universal. Yes. And there's multiple things.
Do you know who Sergei Prozorov is?
I don't know.
Troy, are you thinking of Prozorov here at this point?
Yeah, the talk about false universals immediately set off that alarm bell.
Yeah. So he calls it an imperfect nihilism. It's where you take a regional particularity and you inflate it to the level of the universal.
Yes.
And I feel like that's what you're describing, yeah?
This is exactly what Western philosophy and Western thought and political practice does. When we're talking about, what is justice? Or what is whatever other, adding whatever concept you want. And you find out the history of that is actually the history of white justice, European justice. And not only have you acted as if that particular is a universal, but in elevating it to the universal, what you do is you also occlude, erase, destroy alternative understandings of what that might mean. In other words, these other particulars that might enrich our understanding of these concepts are destroyed in this very ideological gesture of elevating to the universal. So when you talk about, class-first politics that rejects identity, so-called identity, or that rejects, analysis or sort of organizing around race, it's literally the same fucking thing, because you're talking about people saying, well, no, we know what this universal parameter of the struggle is. It's class, of course. And like, okay, well, why? All right, well, based on your very specific particular understanding, based on certain Marxist narratives and other narratives, with very little relationship to the rest of the world. And again, you can make important arguments about the function of class and the varieties of class in China, in Latin America, but you actually need to do that and understand that it's not the formal working class. Often it's maybe the poor as a category, or the people as a category, a class category that is the sort of category of struggle that's relevant to the context. But what we need to do is draw. We need to push back the universal and pull the particular into its rightful place, not as an anti-universal gesture, not as a rejection, not as a particularity, not as pure relativism where we say everything is cool and all sort of cultures are equal, but as an understanding of the fact that most of what we're talking about and calling universal is bullshit anyway, and that we need to begin to think differently.
George, you mentioned the concept of the people, and I know that comes from Enrique Dussel, right?
That's who I rely on often when I'm talking about the category and who I look to for important parameters, but it comes from social struggles in Latin America. This is one thing, if I'll go on a little, tangent, which is to say that, I engage in part in the book with people like Michael Hart and Tony Negri and Paulo Virno, who talk about the multitude as a category of struggle. My first response is really just a knee-jerk one, which is to say, like, literally fucking no one knows what the multitude is. So if you walk down the street in Caracas and say, all right, the multitude this, the multitude that, again, you're positioning yourself as an analyst of society, not as someone who's engaged in these struggles, because that category is essentially useless outside of maybe Argentina and a couple of other places in small circles. Now, what you mean by that category is a different question. It entails a certain kind of social action that I'm very critical of as well. The idea that the multitude acts simultaneously and without as much organization, maybe as others might, grant, and acts sort of directly and in unmediated, unrepresented, etc. What category of struggle matters in Latin America the most? And this is a long-standing debate. But part of what the most important theorists of the people and populism often have come out of Latin America, and then they've come out of a Marxism that they found very difficult to connect to people's everyday struggles. Now, the best Marxism, of course, the best Latin American Marxism in particular, thinks hard about the class constellation, as Mariátegui did. Thinks hard about what's something that even Lenin talked about in terms of the people as unifying the working class and the peasantry. But also even beyond that, what other sectors are potentially revolutionary sectors. And thinks hard about what kind of categories can draw those together. And the people is more often than not the one that is used, right? As in El Pueblo Unido Jamás Será Vencido, like the chant. This is the people, not as, as we use it, for example, in the United States, as meaning everybody, but as an explicitly class concept of rupture and struggle against the existing order. Now, the people is a contested concept. Reactionaries, right-wingers, conservatives, liberals use the concept as well because it's a mandatory reference point. But this doesn't change the fact that it is the sort of reference point for, for Latin American struggles, and that there's nothing wrong with grasping and understanding that and pushing it in a radical revolutionary direction, and understanding the fact that in that class is essential, but so too are women's struggles and student struggles and Afro-Indigenous struggles, and trying to figure out a way for those, in the best of cases, to mutually deepen each other, as what I call in the last chapter of the book, these sort of micro-dialectics within a broader dialectic of the people.
Hmm. Yeah, I find this so fascinating. Again, I mean, I'm going to mention him, but we did another book club on this podcast, so people listening might remember it, on Sergei Prozorov, who wrote these 2 volumes called Void Universalism. It's volume 1 and volume 2, and in it he's trying to basically argue for global politics. Is there such a thing as world politics? And he says that there's a tendency towards imperfect nihilism, is where you take a regional narrative and you inflate it to the status of the universal. And he says we obviously don't want that, so that's why post-structuralist critiques of meta-narrative and whatnot are useful, because they help us see that is a false universal, really. It's not a real universal, it's a suppressive universal. And then he says, but then at the same time, the other pitfall is to go to the opposite extreme, which is just like endless competing regional narratives, right? And he calls that, is that what he calls a passive nihilism, Troy?
I actually don't remember.
I think it was a
it is. Yeah, it's
and then
he's appropriating the Nietzschean term.
Right, and then the active nihilism was like Carl Schmitt, where it's like the force of the will.
That's right, yeah.
Right, yeah. That sort of thing. And then he kind of like tries to move away from all of those and ground what he calls a void universalism, which is this axiomatic, because he wants to provide an ontology of world politics. And he wants to he uses Alain Badiou and some of like Heidegger's category of the nothing, right? Das Nicht. And the idea that when you get to the void, when you kind of strip back the world of all of the particularities, you find at the void, interestingly enough, those 3 principles of the French Revolution, which he finds to be these axiomatic universals that ground ontological global experience, which are community, equality, and freedom. And he then thinks that it's possible to almost use that as a barometer by which we can, let's say, critique any sort of then actual historical structure, because you can look at it and you can say, to what extent does it, or is it informed by freedom, equality, and community? And, some things might have a lot of freedom and equality, but no community, or some have equality and community, but no freedom, or whatever combinations of those 3. And so it becomes a useful barometer for him. And I think one of the things that I like about the project is that he's unabashedly trying to work towards a universalism. And I think that there's something in your work as well that I find very refreshing. You are firmly rooted in a sort of like post-colonial critique. So you can think of people like Spivak, but at the same time, you're not as critical necessarily of the universal as a lot of post-colonial theorists are. And I think there's something really interesting in trying to, as Prozorov says, really try to say we are committed to the idea that there is a for-all. There really is a for-all. What does it mean? We don't really know. We're working through that, but we can kind of create the for-all through like insurgencies or antagonism to capitalism or et cetera. Does that seem?
Yeah, I mean, insofar as you're, as you put it at the end, creating this, then that's something that I might be on board with. I think my hesitance to any approach that seeks to approximate the universal through a process of abstraction is that I think that takes us further away from where we're trying to get. Part of the problem with the principles of the French Revolution, for example, particularly liberty, equality, equality, and fraternity, is that they were mere principles, right? They were held at the level of principle, or they were principles that applied concretely to some. That they were, the denunciation. This is the story of the Western world in the age of revolutions: is that there's a denunciation of metaphorical slavery, alongside a utter reliance and justification of concrete slavery of real people. And so, part of what the Haitian revolutionaries do is to look at France and say, well, they're saying liberty, equality, fraternity. Like, here's what that means to us. And they put it into action and they make it concrete. Aimé Césaire has this great quote where he says, the abstract refuses to remain abstract in the hands of the oppressed. It becomes concrete, and that changes it fundamentally, right? When you make equality into a real thing instead of something that we fucking say on Fox News and MSNBC, it's a radical transformation. But there's something essential, I think, about understanding it as a transformation. So here's where I think I disagree more with people like Zizek. Zizek recognizes the importance of this, what he would see maybe as an appropriation. He says there's this great scene where the Haitian rebels are singing, these French anthems, right? And appropriating the French anthems. But for Zizek, that points to a indifference. In other words, a universal. It points to this, what he calls the fundamental sameness of these struggles. And I actually don't think we're talking about fundamental sameness. We're talking about a transformation. We're talking about an appropriation that transforms, that changes fundamentally by concretizing. And by concretizing in the context of racial slavery, of saying our freedom is a concrete, substantive freedom. And you could say, well, freedom was concrete for people, of course, that were participating in the French Revolution and achieving certain goals. But you still come out of the French Revolution and the American Revolution and many others with a formal notion of freedom and a formal notion of equality that is not paralleled by a substantive understanding. I mean, this is the reality of today, right? We talk about equality of opportunity, and yet, every structure of the world militates against these things. And so I think there's something very fundamental that's done when the colonized and oppressed and Black and brown people worldwide take up these concepts, because they make them into something different, and I would argue something more important, something better, something that improves the world for everyone by making equality a real thing.
Well, Troy, I'll give you the last word here, since we're kind of running up against the limit, and we'll let George get back to his busy life. Yeah,
I think that was a wonderful way to kind of end it off, talking about the passivity and the just incompleteness of abstract use of these principles. And I couldn't help but thinking, as you were talking, George, about freedom as being one of these great principles, one of the principles of the French Revolution, and certainly the one that seems to be bandied about the most in American discourse. And it's just a concept that I don't think anybody really has an idea what the content is. Everyone seems to appropriate the idea of freedom for different causes and issues, which pretty easily can be thought of as being the most unfree things, right? We're supposed to be the nation of freedom, and yet most everyone just does what their parents does when they grow up, right? Like, that should be the evidence against the idea that we have freedom, the substantive kind, even if we think that somehow we've fulfilled some abstract principle.
Yeah, no, I mean, you've got this whole, of course, debates around positive freedoms and negative freedoms and debate, but all these debates are the result of the fact that we don't actually believe in freedom, that we don't even believe in the freedom of, the adjustment that Marx provided, which is to say, what freedom? Freedom with a gun to your head, starve or work is not freedom either, right? And so, this is where Marx's insistence on the concretization of that freedom is essential as well. And the filling out of that in a decolonial way, helps us to get closer and closer to understanding the gaps between our principles and reality, between the law and reality, between the Constitution and lived reality. But of course, these are incredibly dangerous things to uphold if you're looking at it from the perspective of the powerful and the wealthy, because real equality is something that they don't want. And real freedom and real fraternity are certainly things that they don't want, because they all understood, even separately, but fundamentally understood together in all of their fullness, point toward communism.
Well, should we wrap it up there, guys?
Yeah, I think that was wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on, George. Really appreciate your insights and your willingness and your epistemological humility, even though you should probably be even more epistemologically arrogant than you are.
Nah, I mean... We're just working and building and struggling, and this is what we need to keep doing. So thank you all for the conversation, and for having me as a part of it.
Yeah, of course. So for people listening, if they don't already follow you on Twitter, fucking follow him on Twitter. He's amazing. But where else can people find you? What can we look forward to? Do you want to tell us a little bit about your organizing work real quick, or books that you're working on? Anything like that?
So yeah, my Twitter is Ciccmaher, Ciccmaher. I live in Philadelphia, and have been involved here for a while, particularly in anti-police work. And it's a very interesting moment in the city with a lot of different abolitionist organizing going on, anti-police organizing, anti-ICE organizing that's been going on. And so it's been an incredibly interesting moment, and working on a few things, but including work on the abolition of the police, on what a world without police would look like. And so that's one of the things that I'm hoping to work on. But I'm also, basically unemployed. So, navigating this sort of extra academic space and attempting to figure out what we can do inside, outside at the borders of academia moving forward.
Sounds great, man. Well, again, I thank you 1,000 times. Hopefully we can get you back on again. I'd love to chat more, maybe specifically about kind of your next stuff, especially if you do end up producing some public works on the abolition of policing. That would be a really interesting chat to have. So
Absolutely.
Thank you so
Let's
much.
do it.
Awesome, brother. Awesome. So now it's time to get into our sticky leaves. After such an invigorating conversation with George Ciccariello-Maher, now it's time to talk about something else that invigorates our lives. This is the segment of the podcast where one of us gets to share something that is giving us meaning in a world that is oftentimes, perhaps, maybe devoid of meaning. Troy, what is giving you life, brother?
I feel so privileged, Austin, because in this podcast, I got to talk about all of our usual great stuff in philosophy and politics. I could talk about basketball for a little while. And then I'm also going to talk about metal for a few minutes here.
Oh, God.
All of my adolescent pastimes in one. So if you've listened to the podcast for any length of time, you know that I had a long period of time where I was a metalhead. I still listen to at least some metal, although it's drifted a lot away from me the last several years, mostly because I think most of metal out there just kind of sucks. It's in a real dead period right now. That's just my own opinion, but there's still some good stuff out there. And with that said, I still think and would like to defend the place of metal in music and in culture. And I had two experiences this past week around heavy metal culture, or on the fringes in some sense of heavy metal culture, that I thought were really invigorating and fun and represent some of the best aspects of metal. One of them was seeing a band called Metalachi in concerts, and this band Metalachi is the world's first and only metal mariachi band.
I fucking knew that. I'm so happy right now.
Do you know about them?
No, but I love it.
So I saw this band. They're playing really close to where I live, and so I was like, oh, I got to check this out. It was pretty cheap, and I could get there really easily. And it sounded like a fun gimmick, right? but they were actually really fun. They're a straight up mariachi band. Like I'm pretty sure that they play quinceañeras and weddings and stuff. And they just decided to dress up, kind of like a sort of confluence of metalhead and mariachi band, and they play only mariachi instruments. Like there's acoustic bass and there's a guitar, but it's not heavily distorted or anything. And then a violin and everything else, and a trumpet. And they do mariachi versions of classic hard rock and metal songs.
That's amazing.
And they have a great stage banter that they do between songs, and they're all just about partying and having fun. There's nothing really deep or serious about it. But they actually cared about these songs, which is one of the cool things. So they didn't just play like your classic, 80s hair metal stuff, which probably would have been what the audience would have wanted. But they played like Slayer's Raining Blood. And they played a couple of Iron Maiden songs, like Run to the Hills. And they played Megadeth, Symphony of Destruction. And you could tell by some of the things they said and the way they actually played the songs, but just in mariachi form, and that they cared about these things and then used them as like a positive force for bringing people together and having fun. And I really loved that, and I really appreciated how much effort they put into making their show good, and not just being a gimmick. So I want to, prop up those guys because they're awesome. And then my second thing is I saw a movie called Heavy Trip. Have you heard of this movie?
No.
It played at some of the film festivals last year, and it got a lot of good buzz. It's a Finnish movie about a Finnish death metal band that is in some small rural town, and so they never actually do anything other than play in their mom's basement. And then they decide to get serious and be a real band and try and get into a Norwegian metal festival. Okay. And it's all in Finnish, but it's really hilarious. It plays on a bunch of stereotypes about metalheads, but at the same time, I watched it with some people who had no knowledge of metal at all, and they thought it was pretty fun and ridiculous too.
Okay.
So I would encourage anybody out there who just enjoys comedies, especially comedies that revolve around bands. If you've ever been in a band, you'll find things that are funny about this. It's really wonderful and great. And it's one of those great comedies that in no way makes fun of any of its characters in like a disparaging or usury type way. It's sort of, it has fun with them rather than making fun of them. And I really appreciate that. As much as I love Spinal Tap is making fun of the characters. Right. And it's still hilarious and a great movie. But this movie has fun with the characters. At the same time, it cares about them and it takes their ideas and their actions and their behavior seriously while also finding it extremely comical. So anybody out there who wants to watch this movie, it's called Heavy Trip. Definitely try and find it. I don't know how you'll find it because it's Finnish and I don't think you can stream it anywhere. But if you can find it, let us know and I'll try to publicize it on the Twitter or something.
Putlocker. Did that come across?
Yeah.
Sorry. I will say this. So Finnish cinema is really underrated. One of my favorite films that I've seen in the last couple of years was called The Other Side of Hope, which was a Finnish film. And I had really known nothing. I knew nothing about Finnish cinema until I saw that. And I'm kind of like, oh, there's some good shit coming out of Finland, man. It's just, it's so, for me, it seems like such a foreign European nation coming from America. We think of like France and Spain and Ireland and Germany, but we kind of forget about the other ones that are up a little bit further north. The Norwegians, the Danes get some love because Lars von Trier and Nicholas Winding Refn, as we talked about previously, and stuff like that. But Finland, I feel like,
and the Swedes obviously have Bergman and a lot of classic cinema.
Right, exactly. But the Finnish people, they kind of fly under the radar. It seems like a lot of times, but yeah, good shit, man. Cool, dude.
All right, so that's it for this week, yeah?
Yeah, I think so, man.
So if you're out there and you want to leave us a review on iTunes, 5-star review A rating and review, we'd definitely appreciate that. It helps us get the podcast out to more people. And again, if you want to ask a question in your review, we will read it on the air, as we did at the beginning of this episode.
Sounds good.
Where else can we find us, Austin?
Twitter, owls_at_dawn. We got a Facebook page. You can follow us there. You can find us on patreon.com/owlsatdawn. We have bonus episodes that you can access, as well as a newsletter that's complete with like sticky leaves and shitty minutes and articles that we've been reading that we recommend, and other recommendations and things like that. You can also be a part of the Democracy Motherfuckers tier, which is where you can get access to suggesting topics for the next patron-led episode. And as we said, the winner for this last patron poll is about the relationship between art and problematic artists, or just creators, let's say, and problematic individuals. And then where else can people find? Oh, you can email us, owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com. And we want to say thanks once again to George Ciccariello-Maher for coming on. Check him out on Twitter. Check out any of his books. He has some great books on Venezuela, the one that's about Chavez, the one on building the commune, and then, of course, Decolonizing Dialectics, the one that we talked about today. So check those out as well. I think that's pretty much it, right, brother? Anything else?
Just one more thing, dude.
What? What's that?
До свидания, Amerikansky.